Hello and welcome to the BizNews Debrief, where we're going to unpack this week's top stories from biznews.com, TV, and radio. I'm your host, Patrick Kidd. We're now 2 weeks on from BNC 8, where 600 delegates gathered in Omanis to hear from some of South Africa's and the world's best minds. The BizNews production team have put together a short highlights package to give a little taster of the conference content published on BizNews this week.
Ladies and gentlemen, for 3 decades now, a fatal idea has spread throughout society and the business community in South Africa. But it has spread insidiously, posing as noble and ethical. So much so, in fact, that this idea has not only been warmly embraced and promoted by many in the business community, but even lauded and boasted about in well-intentioned boardrooms across the country. This idea is not just an idea, it is an ideology. An entire framework for organizing political and economic life. And as this ideology spreads throughout the state departments, businesses, and social institutions of society, it begins to suffocate and destroy all in its path. This ideology is Transformationism, the guiding framework for state policy in South Africa.
In the end, Rome's collapse was literal. There are modern examples too, and to this day, the lessons of Rome flash in neon lights for cities and countries as they do for Joburg. Their most existential threat is infrastructure collapse. The physical infrastructure and the political infrastructure. Joburg's fault lines bear an uncanny resemblance to those which toppled Rome. We all know that Joburg is in a dire state, but I really underestimated just how bad it is. We can all see what is wrong by driving through it, but it is even more alarming when you discover why it is wrong and that it can still get worse.
The corrupt government diverts public resources meant to serve the people into networks of patronage and self-enrichment. Illicit markets are allowed to thrive while law-abiding entrepreneurs confront excessive red tape and growth-killing policies. Municipalities collapsing under the weight of mismanagement, leaving communities without the most basic of services. But ultimately, when the rule of law collapses, personal liberty is one of the first casualties, unfortunately.
So the ANC is wonderfully considerate in one sense. When it wants to threaten our personal liberties, it packages its intentions in 3-letter abbreviated form. So have you noticed this? EWC, NHI, BEE. But I want to talk about a less obvious threat to our personal liberty. And that is the threat that arises because of collapsing municipalities and the inability of local government to turn tax into public goods, in particular infrastructure.
The issue is that the entire institution, and when I say that, I mean SAPS, the Hawks, the MPA, the entire security cluster has over time been hollowed out. And I want to just pause for a second on that hollowing out, because for so long, I've heard people say, but they're just incompetent. That's an old excuse. I'm telling you today that the majority of the hollowing out was absolutely intentional. It was absolutely deliberate, because the ANC and the criminal cartels linked to them cannot function the way that they need to function in order to loot state coffers if they do not control the police. So they have to hollow it out. They have to make sure that it doesn't function, because otherwise they wouldn't have money to steal.
I titled this talk, With It to South Africa, with your heart in the East, but your wallet in the West. And this kind of is quite an apt description of the way government views our relationships with the rest of the world. The East is kind of where all the romance is, all the love is. It's Iran was that girlfriend from high school that you just can't quite let go of. That's really not good for you. That is how it feels to me. On the other hand, when we want things like FDI, when we're looking for markets to export complex manufactured goods, it's all to the West. And so this creates a very interesting conundrum in how we formulate our policy.
Every week, BizNews journalist Chris Steyn sits down with election analyst Wayne Sussman on the Electoral Roadshow. On this week's episode, Sussman unpacked how the political landscape in South Africa has shifted after the last 3 months of by-elections across the country.
So if we review the first 3 months of the year, again, that theme of the ANC struggling in Gauteng townships, this is something they have to turn around. And this, I think, would be the thing which worries them the most. The other key theme is the IFP in KwaZulu-Natal. And yes, these are rural areas where not many voters are, but the IFP, these are the by-elections taking place, and they're showing up. It's what's in front of them, and they're doing very, very well. So this is a key thing, is how well is the IFP going to do in KwaZulu-Natal? We've noticed that Umkhonto we Sizwe have not been able to replicate their showing from 2024. There was a theme we saw in 2025, but they're still on track to do well and hurt the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal. We've seen the ANC and certainly the EFF continue to struggle in KwaZulu-Natal. So we're seeing the IFP and to a lesser extent, the MK, the major factors there. And then the Patriotic Alliance, from the Northern Cape to the Western Cape Platteland, beyond the city of Cape Town, to that Sarah Baartman district in the Eastern Cape. They've picked up many wards in 2026. They have a lot of momentum. Now, again, these are not areas with large concentrations of voters, but they are showing up and winning wards. They have picked up 2 wards in the last 2 weeks. They'll have a lot of momentum. Just a comment on the DA. Last night, getting 16% in an area where they've struggled in the past, like Dunoon. We've seen them do well in the numerous Johannesburg by-elections. The DA have concerns, of course, about the PA and the Freedom Front, but generally are doing very well in metropolitan areas. And we're going to, that's a trend which we've seen develop. So those are the major trends we've seen play out in the first 3 months. And this year is flying past us, Chris.
In surprising news, the Old Stithians associations voted to keep convicted fraudster and BHI Ponzi mastermind Craig Warriner in their ranks. St Stithians old boy Ian McLeod says a small but very vocal minority appears to have blocked the move, and that many alumni are now pushing back.
The vote was rather surprising. The vote was lost. So I think it was 18 people voted against expulsion, 16 voted for expulsion, and for some reason, 6 people turned up on a Friday evening to abstain. So the upshot is that what I think is a small, very vocal lobby turned out to prevent the expulsion of Warriner. And I'm still trying to work out precisely why, but I have some ideas.
Okay, well, give us those ideas, because that sounds astonishing. I mean, here's a guy who's defrauded the association, defrauded the community. People at St Stithians were, taken for a ride by him. He then goes to the police station, hands himself in. He's sitting in jail, so there's no question that he did run a Ponzi scheme, and yet a majority of those who bothered to turn up on a Friday night actually voted to keep him as part of the association. It sounds real weird.
Yes, and I increasingly hear that from more and more alumni who are now hearing about this and coming out and expressing that same shock and this alumni body tends to be a little bit slack, but I think people are now coming out, and I suspect the majority is in favor of expulsion. As far as I can tell, there are two sort of broad reasons which people are mentioning. One is sort of procedural one. There seems to be a concern that the Constitution is too broad. People want guidelines, etc. I have very little sympathy for this. Firstly, you have to read the Constitution as if the framers knew what they were doing and acted with purpose. This is the provision as it is. If we want more details, good idea. We should do that prospectively. Another reason that gets bandied about is this sort of the term used is membership for life. It sounds like it's motivated by something like mercy or something like that. Again, I have very little, in fact, no sympathy for this. As you'll see in the piece I've written, I think that explanation comes down to what Gad Saad calls suicidal empathy. But again, I think it's a very small, loud minority who turned up to prevent the expulsion. And I think the majority of the alumni body have been spurred into action. And I'm talking with old boys from the youngsters with their broccoli haircuts to the old bullies with the dad bods. And there's a great deal of action now to defend the school and to defend all of our individual reputations.
Of course, the big story at the moment is the war in the Middle East. Speaking to BizNews journalist Chris Steyn earlier this week, US intelligence analyst, retired Colonel Chris Wyatt, unpacked how he sees the geopolitical landscape looking if the war were to end at the 2-month mark. Wyatt says that though Iran may have been badly weakened by US attacks, the nation may not be permanently neutralized.
Well, if we can believe the U.S. government, and maybe questions about credibility here by some circles, but if we can believe the U.S. government, well, we actually don't have to believe the U.S. government. We can look in the Arabian Gulf and see the remnants of the Iranian Navy sitting at the bottom of the Arabian Gulf, and one of their ships sitting in the bottom of the Indian Ocean. There is no Arabian Navy. The Iranian missile capability is dramatically degraded. I don't know the numbers, but I would estimate at least 70% of the missiles must be expended or destroyed at this point, if not more. And they have decapitated the leadership. But the thing about this is that air power doesn't win wars, Chris. That's been a myth for decades. That was a big strategic philosophy by air proponents in the 1920s and 30s. You don't need ground troops. Air power will win the war. Unfortunately, the reality is that if you want to make change, someone has to occupy the ground, and that falls to the infantry or armor, whichever the case is. We're not deploying troops. So at the end of the day, Iran will be defanged, at least temporarily, and maybe they'll be set back 3 to 5 years. Maybe. It's hard to say without actually having a measle board and checking off all the actors that are missing, all the things that have been destroyed. We don't know. There is a censorship blackout in Iran, so it's hard to say what's going on. All we have basically for Iran is 2C TV, the Iranian exile who lives in the UK, and of course, CENTCOM, Central Command's footage that they show us in their briefings. So we won't really know until after it ends and people are on the ground. Journalists can go in, people can go in and see what's actually going on. The censorship gets lifted. And by the same token, we don't know how bad things are in Israel because there's a massive censorship taking place there as well. And that's unfortunate because, as I said at the outset of this conversation, the first casualty of war is the truth. And if you have censorship, then it's hard to find the truth. So I think that at the end of this, we're probably going to see that Iran won't be a threat to global security and will be a much smaller threat and menace to its neighbors for 3 to 5 years. But if this regime doesn't go, they'll simply restart all over again. And that means that Trump will accomplish defanging them, but not destroying them. And once he's out of office, this will be someone else's problem. That's my concern.
And with rising concerns over the use of atomic weapons in the Middle East conflicts, concerns over the safety of South Africa's nuclear secrets resurfaced, particularly in the context of the still unsolved attempted robbery at SA's nuclear research site, Pelindaba, in 2007. Nuclear expert Dr. Kelvin Kem joined Chris Steyn this week to answer that very question. How secure is South Africa's enriched uranium?
Chris, it's very safe. It's in a secret place. Only a couple of people know exactly where it is. In fact, very few people know it even exists, but the international community knows, the spy networks of the world know. So what I'm saying now is not going to be news to any of them. And it's within a large site, 2,000 hectare site, which has got a high security fence around it. It's also got multiple buildings, some 150 buildings on the site. And it's in a building, or it's in somewhere, and very secure. It's also not that big in terms of volume. It's a lot in terms of enriched uranium, but it's not as if it's truckloads or something like that. To make a nuclear weapon, you need a piece about like that. It's not big enough to put in the back of a bucky. So a piece like that will give you an almighty bang.
Dr. Kim, if South Africa decided to secretly give some enriched uranium to another country, who would have to authorize its transport or its removal from the facility?
Well, firstly, Chris, I must mention the Pelindaba Treaty. There's a Pelindaba Treaty which is signed by African countries. I think all the African countries, maybe two minor ones haven't, but as my memory serves me, that's been signed. And the Pelindaba Treaty was the first one in the world that said an area will declare itself a nuclear weapons-free zone. So that came into effect quite a few years ago now. So we already are in the treaty that says we're a weapons-free zone. We also have agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, UN, and others that we will not pursue any weapons of mass destruction in the future, of which weapons that are nuclear is part of it. And I'm on that council, as you mentioned in the beginning. So in principle, what you ask, it would only be authorized at the highest level of government. But in fact, the Council of ISATOM is there to stop anybody doing it, whether it's the government or private enterprise. Anything of that nature comes through the Council. And the Council has a look. Is this something that could conceivably be used in a weapon? And if it is, then the Council asks for it to be examined, and if there's any suspicion, it will be prohibited.
But where the Middle East conflict is set to hurt South Africans the most is at the petrol pump. With the petrol price set to rise by around 6 Rand a litre and the diesel price by 9 Rand, the DA's finance spokesperson, Dr. Mark Burke, revealed his party's proposal to reduce that shock for the South African consumer. He says the DA has proposed a reduction in both the fuel levy and road accident fund levy, which he says accounts for close to 30% of the current petrol price. Burke spoke to BizNews editor Alec Hogg on Wednesday.
What we've tried to do here is present to our partner in the government a funded 6 months breathing room plan at least, as well as a measure that we can implement hopefully by next week to absorb some of the shock. That doesn't mean that we should stop pursuing all these other pots of money that's inefficient and sucking money from the fiscus and South Africans. But at the moment, at least, we've articulated a clear plan that can be actioned in a short frame of time.
How's it been met?
Well, I will be asking the Minister of Finance a question about this in the House later today. I've sent a letter both to the President and the Minister of Finance, but it's early days. In fact, you are the first interview I'm doing after our press conference today. So I will have to get back to you on what the reception is. But it is worth saying at this juncture that there's the high road here, which is us collaborating with the ANC, and that is what we're proposing here. We are not saying in this conversation that the minister is solely responsible for the oil price shock. But we are saying there are things within our control. The war in the Middle East might be outside of our control. But what is within our control is wasteful government expenditure. So the high road option here is for the ANC to work with us. But the alternative, of course, is for them to blue tick a good faith, politically neutral proposal. And they'll then have to explain to South Africans why petrol is going up by 6 Rand and diesel by 9 Rand. And so it's my hope that the response to this will actually be collaborative as opposed to abrasive.
That's been this week's BizNews Debrief. I'm Patrick Kidd for BizNews.com. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.